Well, a surprise strategy message from Te Pāti Māori at their campaign launch. We don't want your party vote.
Forget about the party vote, it's all about the electorate seats.
There's one plan, 2 votes.
And potentially huge consequences.
The aim and intent is they want to make sure that they create an overhang for the point and purpose that if they lose the election on the popular vote, and they may well do, they can sabotage democracy in this country.
Hi, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, Te Pāti Māori is urging supporters to vote only for its electorate candidates. But could it reshape the next parliament?
The party is asking voters to back its 7 electorate candidates, but not to give the party a second tick at the ballot box.
The reason that we are asking for our people to do the candidate vote for Te Pāti Māori is because we now need to push to have a one-term government.
Which I have to say provides us with ever more proof that the Māori seats must go because they have the capacity and the way that they are going to be gerrymandered at this election to do irreparable damage to race relations in this country and democracy.
It's a calculated electoral gamble, and just how it works can also be, well, confusing. So today I sit down with Newsroom senior political reporter Mark Dalder, who has been covering this story at length.
Te Pāti Māori wants to change the government, and they're willing to do just about anything that they can to get there, even if it means tactics that many say are not in line with the spirit of MMP or the electoral system.
Now, before we get into those tactics, Mark updates us on where Te Pāti Māori is sitting in the latest polls, 10 weeks out from the election.
I think a lot lower than they were this time last year after the highs of the Tamaki Makaurau by-election where they were actually polling above 5%. Lately, you've kind of had 2 sets of numbers, one in the sort of 1 to 1.5% range, and then a few other polls have put them at 3% or so, which is a reasonable difference, but well below 5%, so clearly needing to win an electorate if they want to return to Parliament.
And clearly this leads us to their strategy. Mark, what exactly is their strategy? What are they asking its supporters to do, and more importantly, why?
Yeah, I mean, part of the strategy is still not fully determined yet, but what we've heard from them is that they're going to be campaigning and focusing on the candidate vote, on the electorate vote. So that's going to be in the 7 Māori seats where they've got a candidate running in each. They currently hold 4 of them, and their candidates in those 4 seats are running for re-election, so that, being an incumbent gives you an advantage. And then they're trying to wrest back Te Tai Tonga and Te Tai Tokerau from Maria Mino Kapakingi and Takuta Ferris, and also take Labour's Ikaroa Rafferty as well. So they're saying, give us your candidate vote, elect us in these seats, and party vote, it's up to you. A little bit different from what they had maybe suggested before, that they might say give your party vote specifically to a different party, but they've said, look, we're agnostic. You can give it to us if you want, but we're really campaigning for your candidate vote.
So what does this mean for Parliament? Because we've normally got 120 MPs and seats. They all talk about the overhang. What happens if they get all 7 seats? What is this overhang?
Essentially, there are a few ways this could play out, but the one that I think people are most looking at is the scenario where Te Pāti Māori does get some party vote, but not a lot, say 1 to 2%, and they win 4 or 5 or 6 or even 7 seats. And what that means in terms of how the MMP calculation is done after the election is that you'll get a bigger parliament than 120 members. You'll get this overhang. Te Pāti Māori will still be able to bring in everyone who actually won a seat. Because they win 1 more seats than they were entitled to in the party vote, you get a bigger parliament. So we already have an overhang in the current parliament. It's 123 seats at the moment, and 2 of those seats are because of Te Pāti Māori's overhang. And in a very close election, which this is looking like, where it's really hard to tell whether it's going to go with Labour or National, Te Pāti Māori is very firmly aligned with Labour. An overhang that's the same size as currently or even bigger could have a really big impact on who actually forms a government after the election.
So could it mean that they hold the balance of power? Even though they have a relatively small party vote, could they have a lot of influence?
I wouldn't necessarily say balance of power, because we traditionally think of the party that holds the balance of power being the party that makes the final decision. And that's a party that would go either way. I think we can tell Te Pāti Māori isn't going to work with National. I don't think National is going to work with Te Pāti Māori. But more what it could mean is that it could affect the balance of power. It could make the difference between the left having enough seats to form a government or not having enough seats to form a government. And while we've had overhangs in the past, we've never had them be the deciding factor in that way.
Now, before we go on to the public and political reactions, Te Pāti Māori's co-leaders, Debbie Ngarewa-Packer and Rawiri Waititi, do have another option in their bag of tactics. They don't submit a party list.
And so Debbie Ngarewa-Packer, I've asked her a couple times now whether Te Pāti Māori will submit a list, and she said, look, we're focused on the candidate vote now, we haven't made a decision on that, basically. And why that matters is due to a quirk in the Electoral Act. If you don't submit a list, effectively you're counted kind of like you would be independents, and so you don't actually create an overhang. So if Te Pāti Māori submits a list and wins 4 seats and gets 1% of the vote or whatever, then you maybe end up with a parliament with 123 seats and 4 of them are Te Pāti Māori MPs. But if it doesn't submit a list, you end up with a parliament of 120 seats, 4 of them are Te Pāti Māori MPs, and everyone else's share of the pie through the party vote is distributed among the remaining 116 seats. So what that means is Te Pāti Māori's it's still disproportionate, and in fact more disproportionate. They now have 4 out of 120 seats instead of 4 out of 123 seats. And so, that's an option for them to try and boost their own influence as well. It's hard to say exactly what that might mean in terms of who governs or who doesn't. I did the numbers on the last One News Varian poll and looked at, well, if they ran a list or if they didn't run a list, what would the difference be? And it was the difference between Labour being able to govern without Te Pāti Māori and just with the Greens and Opportunity, versus if they didn't submit a list, then they needed Te Pāti Māori's votes as well. So it'll be interesting to see there. It could have an impact on the margins, but again, a lot of this is on the margins, and the election might be decided on the margins, so I think anything has to be considered very carefully.
Either way, the party's one-vote plan has critics up in arms.
Now, you've got to remember, this isn't some just sort of weird concept now. This is now the endorsed concept of Te Pāti Māori to sabotage democracy.
Is that fair or right? Are they sabotaging democracy?
Look, without offering an opinion on that phrasing in particular, I think it would be fair to say that, the purpose of the Māori seats is to ensure that there's representation for Māori in Parliament, and that there certainly in the 1860s and 70s, there were concerns that you wouldn't be electing Māori through general seats, and there was no list at the time. So some of that has changed a little bit in recent years. So we have many Māori MPs in Parliament, and most of them are not in the Māori seats. But the principle still stands that having, with a treaty relationship that's built on the principle of partnership, that having carve-outs to ensure that Māori do have some representation in Parliament regardless of the political circumstances, that there's a clear argument for that. The Māori seats are not necessarily designed to be able to do this sort of overhang type thing. It's not unique in the Māori seats to be able to create an overhang. So we've seen overhangs coming out of other situations before. You can think of Epsom when ACT was polling in the less than 1% range would often create an overhang, and same as well with Ohariu and United Future and so on and so forth. So it's not unique to the Māori seats, but there are some special factors here that mean that the ability to create an overhang in the Māori seats is maybe stronger than elsewhere, and I'd be happy to talk about that if that would be helpful.
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Critics of what Te Pāti Māori has announced in terms of its campaign strategy, they've said, well, look, what's stopping, say, National from saying, actually, don't give us your party vote. Give your party vote to ACT in New Zealand first and give us your electorate vote. And I think the New Zealand Initiative figured out you could get an overhang of like 12 or 19 seats or something like that. A huge overhang that would fundamentally mean there's no chance that Labour would ever be able to govern in an election where something like that happened. And what actually stops National from doing that, there's no law against it, is that we think probably voters would punish them for it. Voters would say, hey, this isn't fair. We're not going to vote for your candidates in the electorates. Maybe we won't even vote for ACT in New Zealand first because we think they're kind of in on this deal. And so they would be punished for it. The difficulty with the Māori seats is because they're only voted for and voted in by Māori. Te Pāti Māori doesn't need to care about how the rest of the country feels about this move it's made. All it needs to care about is how Māori voters feel about it. And while I think many Māori voters will look at this and go, we're really not a big fan of deals, many others will go, we really want to get rid of this government, particularly people who are enrolled to vote in the Māori seats, and say, hey, look, fair play. Fundamentally, it is leveraging the difference between the Māori seats and general seats, which is that the Māori seats are only able to be voted for by Māori voters who have enrolled on the Māori roll, to insulate Te Pāti Māori from some of the political consequences that other mainstream parties might face if they tried to do a similar overhang strategy. And what that really means, and we can get into this, is there's a risk here for Te Pāti Māori, because the purpose of the Māori seats is to ensure Māori representation. There are many people who say, hey, look, what you're doing here, this is not the purpose of the Māori seats. And if it's the scenario where it comes close to or actually does decide who governs after the election, you've already got New Zealand First and ACT saying they want to abolish the Māori seats or hold a referendum on abolishing them.
New Zealand First are going to campaign on a referendum on abolishing the Maori seats, which is totally and utterly the right thing to do. I'm just going to put my stake in the ground here.
With the current Maori seat holders showing how much of a mess they are in, it's proven that the time has come for the public to decide if they are effective, relevant, and if they are needed.
National hasn't gone that far, but it's not hard to imagine that in a scenario where they are out of power purely by virtue of this strategy that Te Pāti Māori has adopted, that might change in a future government. So it might be, some tactical brilliance from Te Pāti Māori to get a little bit of a political edge, an electoral edge, and get a better chance of ousting the current government. But it might be a strategic sort of misstep in the long term, because without the Māori seats, Te Pāti Māori won't exist. We've never seen them get more than 5% of the vote, and it seems that that's, not likely to change. And so they're reliant on the existence of those seats to operate themselves as a party. And if they were to be abolished, the consequences would go well beyond Te Pāti Māori itself, but even if you're just Debbie Ngarewa-Packer or Rawiri Waititi or John Tamihere, you'd want to make sure you're thinking carefully about, hey, what's the long-term prospect of our party's survival if we do this?
Gosh, it's a huge gamble for them then, Mark, and I know they did it at their launch. Feedback right now, I know it's early days, but do you think it could pay off, or are you sitting on the fence with that one?
Well, part of the difficulty is it is really hard to tell how things will work out in the Māori seats. Electorates generally are hard to poll. Māori seats are very hard to poll because they are so large. The largest Māori electorate is the largest electorate. It's Te Tai Tonga, which covers the entire South Island and the Chatham Islands and Stewart Island and Wellington.
Oh, it's huge.
It's gigantic. And so how do you get a representative survey of Māori voters on the Māori roll across that vast swathe of land? So it is hard to get accurate numbers, and so you're just left with reckons, and most people who have reckons have biases behind them. I think it seems clear that Te Pāti Māori is likely to survive. It's likely to get re-elected, and it seems like it's strongest in the seats that it already holds, where it has incumbents. Orini Kaipara won such a resounding victory in the Tamaki Makaurau by-election. It's hard to imagine her getting turfed out. Hana Rafiri Maipi Clark is just sort of an icon in Māoridom, generally in Indigenous circles worldwide, I think, at this stage. And so, that seems like a pretty safe seat for her. And then you've got the co-leaders who you'd hope would be able to prevail in their own seats in Te Tai Hauauru and Waiariki. After that, it gets harder to say. So, whether this strategy actually moves the needle, it's unclear. I think the reaction to the strategy has, outside of Te Pāti Māori, by and large been negative, and that's come from Labour and the Greens, who have said, hey, look, this isn't necessarily the right way to go about this, and we're still running our candidates. We want competitive races in the Māori seats. But of course, they want to say that because they want to win the seats.
Yes.
And National and New Zealand First and ACT, raising concerns about how this might be affecting the proportionality of Parliament. And then you've got political scientists as well, making those same points around, what are people going to think about the legitimacy of the electoral system if the government is decided by whether or not Te Pāti Māori wins Te Tai Tokoro, in a four-way race between some very competitive and very strong candidates from Labour, Te Pāti Māori, the Greens, and Maria Mino Kapakingi running in her own sort of party. Should one electorate decide who governs when that's not normally how MMP and the proportionality system is meant to work?
Could Te Pāti Māori shoot themselves in the foot if it's annoying, say, Labour and the Greens, and if, say, on November 7 there is a surge towards the left and Labour goes, actually, we've got enough with opportunity, with the Greens, with us, we don't need Te Pāti Māori and their games, and game over?
I think that there's a strong incentive generally for Labour to try and form a government without Te Pāti Māori if they can. I don't think that this particular decision is a huge factor in that, but I think Chris Hipkins is wary of what he might describe as the antics of Te Pāti Māori in Parliament and of Labour being associated with that. So if he's able to form a government without them, I think he will be keen to do that. And if he does need them to form a government, I think it's unlikely that they would be sitting around the cabinet table. I think something like a confidence and supply arrangement is much more likely. Whether Te Pāti Māori would take that, another question.
But still, will Labour and the Greens benefit from Te Pāti Māori's plan by getting their party vote?
Well, there was a theory that Te Pāti Māori would effectively do a deal with the Greens where they would say, hey, vote for our candidates and give your party vote to the Greens, and maybe the Greens would sort of tell their candidates running the Māori seats to focus on the party vote rather than the electorate vote. And we kind of have heard some conflicting things. Debbie Ngāre-Opakra said that Te Pāti Māori didn't discuss any of that with the Greens. The Greens said, look, we did talk about campaign strategy, but never any sort of formal agreement or arrangement. But when they came out at their campaign launch, Te Pāti Māori, and said, look, give your party vote to whoever you want to, that kind of seems to signal, hey, that deal, but with the Greens in particular, isn't going ahead. How much of a difference could it make if Te Pāti Māori's party vote all goes to the Greens or Labour? Again, it depends on which polls you're looking at, but 1 to 1.5%, it's an extra seat. It could make a difference in a close election, but maybe not. It is hard to say.
How do you compare this to then the national Epsom deal, where they've done these deals for many years? Interesting, not at the last election.
National's confirmed it's ripping up an historic election deal with ACT and will try to win the seat of Epsom.
Isn't he running 2 ticks blue in every electorate?
Absolutely.
Even Epsom, so you're ruling out a deal with ACT?
Absolutely.
But is this a similar sort of strategy, Mark?
It's similar and also almost the opposite in some ways. So the theory behind the national Epsom deal was, I think, twofold, right? One, that ACT was not going to be polling above 5% in most of those elections, and so they would be out of Parliament entirely. So that's the important context to understand there. And so National said, hey, look, if ACT wins in Epsom, then A, we keep ACT in Parliament, they stay as a political force, and kind of a long-term bet that, hey, maybe someday they might grow a little bit and they'll be able to be a reliable and helpful governing partner in a way that has actually worked out, right? Without ACT in this Parliament, National wouldn't have had the numbers to form a government. Counterfactuals are hard. Things would be very different if ACT wasn't in the Parliament. But as a general principle, they've kept a potential governing partner alive and around through some very tough years for that party. And then also they were relying on what's called the coattail rule, where if you win one electorate, but say you get 3% of the party vote, you actually bring in some list MPs anyways. And so it's almost the opposite of an overhang. It's still proportional because you're getting MPs assigned according to your party vote, but it is more MPs than you would have gotten if you hadn't won that one electorate. If you hadn't won that one electorate, you'd have gotten 0 MPs. So I think it is different in terms of how it worked out and maybe what some of the motivation behind it was, and that was a deal. And in this case, Te Pāti Māori is doing this unilaterally, and Labour and the Greens have been very clear that they are not making deals and they're not proposing deals, and there is no deal, and you should give your candidate vote to the Labour or Green candidate as well as your party vote to Labour or the Greens. But it did have an impact, I suppose, on sort of the fundamental principles behind the MMP system, which is that we want Parliament to be proportional, and that we've decided that there's a threshold of 5%, and that if you don't get more than 5%, then you shouldn't be represented in Parliament. And, the coat-tail rule exists, but there have been people who have argued that it should be gotten rid of. It may be similar as well, just in that none of this is against the rules. All of this is well within the rules. This is the system. People are using the system as it was set up. But the question is this what people wanted when they voted for the system? And how does this affect people's perceptions of the legitimacy of the system?
And does this give legitimacy to when Chris Luxon, created all sorts of headlines a couple of weeks ago when he said, I might have a referendum on MMP?
The Prime Minister is open to having another referendum on the MMP voting system.
Well, it's inexplicable. There could be interesting repercussions, if you know what I mean.
Could people go, actually, maybe it is time for that now with the way this is playing out?
Potentially. I guess the question is whether people see this as part and parcel of MMP in particular, or whether they say this is a result of having Māori seats in particular, which predate MMP, or whether they say, hey, this is actually just a loophole that needs to be closed, and it's not a problem with MMP, it's a problem with an electoral system. Or fourth, whether they say, actually, it's a political culture problem, that any system you design can be hacked. There will always be loopholes in it. And so should we be trying to design an ironclad system, or should we be asking better of our politicians that they don't try and rort the system, and that they do actually follow the intent of proportionality, which sits behind it?
Now, we are 10 weeks out from the election day. Mark Dalder, who is in the driver's seat for this election today?
I think it is... The Opportunity Party is maybe in the driver's seat, in that, they are now regularly polling above 5%, and the polls are pretty clearly showing that almost certainly whoever wants to form a government will need to be working with them. I don't think you could say either Chris Luxon or Chris Hipkins are driving anywhere in particular. They're going nowhere very fast. And so it is really the minor parties generally that are benefiting from that.
And do you think all the current party leaders, and this is from Te Pāti Māori to National to Labour, you talked the two Chris's then, do you think they will all be the same party leaders come November 7?
More likely than not, yes. But, who knows? As we discussed in the detail after the attempt to rule Luxon, the underlying motivations for changing leader, if you're a National Party MP, are not changing. National is not really rising in the polls. And arguably it's getting harder as a result of that rule out of Opportunity, because the more polls show Opportunity in a kingmaker position, the media will say, well, that means they get to choose. But if Luxon really, if we take him at his word that he won't work with Opportunity, then it would be fair to say that most of the polls are showing National with no path to power. And if you change your leader, you can change some of those prior statements as well.
And fair to say, Te Pāti Māori and National will never work together, will they?
Christopher Luxon has ruled out forming a government with Te Pāti Māori, saying National believes in one person, one vote.
They're not a serious outfit. They're an activist organisation that really doesn't have any answers to any of our challenges or opportunities that we have in this country.
Not in their current incarnations. We can remember that the Māori Party of old and National worked together, and in fact they worked together for 9 years. It was the only time that the Māori Party ever had sort of government representation, but they were also punished for it by their voters, and they were turfed out at the 2017 election, had to kind of reformulate and reform. It's hard to imagine Te Pāti Māori today kind of moving back towards that centrist political basis in the near term.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Mark Dalder. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.